London, December 24, 1814. The Beaumont House ballroom blazed with the warm glow of 1,000 beeswax candles, their light dancing across walls draped in holly and ivy and red velvet ribbons. The air hung thick with the mingled scents of pine, cinnamon, and expensive perfumes, while the orchestra played a lively country dance that sent couples whirling across the polished floor in patterns as intricate as the exquisite patterns of frost upon the tall windows overlooking Mayfair. Marianne Cordelia Summerfield stood near the refreshment table, her gloved fingers clutching a glass of champagne she had no intention of drinking, and wondered for the 100th time that evening why she had allowed her mother to persuade her to attend. At 24, she knew precisely what the assembled company thought of her. The whispers followed her like the relentless tide of a cold, gray sea through every London drawing room, every theater box, every social gathering she had dared to attend in the 2 months since her wedding day had become the most public humiliation of the season. Poor Miss Summerfield, left standing at the altar in her wedding dress. Captain Thornton ran off with the Grayson girl the very morning of the ceremony. How utterly humiliating. One would think she might have the dignity to withdraw from the public eye. If stories of healing hearts and unexpected second chances move your soul, subscribe now and join us on this journey through a Christmas that changed everything. You will not want to miss what happens next. Marianne had perfected the art of pretending not to hear. She kept her spine straight, her expression serene, and her movements maintained a studied calm. She had learned these past weeks that survival in society required a performance as carefully choreographed as any quadrille. She would not show weakness, nor would she permit them to witness her distress. Let them see only polished marble where once there had been a vulnerable heart. "Have you noticed?" Lady Caroline Asherton whispered behind her fan to her companion, Lady Dorothea Sinclair, though her voice carried across the space between them with perfect clarity. "Miss Summerfield has appeared at yet another Christmas gathering. One would think after such a spectacular humiliation, she might accept her fate with some grace and retire from view." "Indeed," Lady Dorothea replied with false sympathy dripping from every syllable. "Though I suppose hope springs eternal, even in the most desperate circumstances. After all, what else is a spinster without prospects to do but cling to the edges of society like a barnacle upon a ship?" The words struck like precisely aimed vicious darts. Marianne felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Her vision blurred slightly, though whether from unshed tears or the heat of so many bodies pressed into the overheated ballroom, she could not say. She set down her untouched champagne with hands that trembled ever so slightly and turned toward the terrace doors. Fresh air. She needed fresh air and unmolested quiet before she gave these malicious onlookers the satisfaction of watching her break. Navigating through the crush of guests required every ounce of dignity she possessed. She kept her expression neutral, murmuring polite acknowledgments to acquaintances, stepping carefully around dancing couples, all while her panic beat a frantic tattoo beneath her corset. The terrace doors seemed impossibly far away, a distant, mocking promise. It was then that her control finally shattered. Lady Isabel Grayson appeared in her path, wearing emerald silk that matched her calculating eyes and a smile sharp enough to draw blood. The woman who had stolen Captain Miles Thornton on the very morning Marianne had stood in her wedding gown at St. James' Church, surrounded by flowers and expectant guests and the dawning horror that her intended would never appear. "Miss Summerfield," Isabel said with theatrical surprise, "how brave of you to show your face this evening. I do admire your determination to maintain appearances, though I confess I would have fled to the continent by now if I were in your unfortunate position." Marianne's breath caught in her throat. The ballroom suddenly felt suffocating, the walls pressing inward, the candlelight too bright, the music too loud. She pushed past Isabel without responding, her composure finally, completely, irretrievably destroyed. The conservatory attached to the eastern wing of Beaumont House offered sanctuary. Marianne stumbled through the doors and into the glass-enclosed winter garden, where exotic plants from warmer climates thrived despite the December cold pressing against the windows. The temperature here was cooler than the ballroom, the air scented with damp earth and unfamiliar blossoms. Most importantly, it was empty. Or so she thought. Marianne pressed her back against the cool glass wall and allowed the tears she had held captive all evening to finally fall. Her shoulders shook with the force of suppressed sobs, each one tearing through her chest like physical pain. She had tried so hard to be strong, to maintain her dignity, to prove to society that she could survive this humiliation. But in this moment, alone in the quiet darkness of the conservatory, she allowed herself the luxury of complete surrender to her grief. "Forgive me," a deep voice said from the shadows near the far wall, startling her so badly she nearly cried out. "I did not mean to intrude upon your privacy. I shall leave you to your solitude." Marianne spun around, hastily wiping at her tear-stained cheeks with trembling fingers. A tall figure emerged from behind a massive potted palm, and even in the dim light filtering through from the ballroom, she recognized him immediately. Sebastian Charles Rothermere, Duke of Lennox, perhaps the most notorious recluse in all of London society. She had seen him only twice before, both times at formal events he could not politely avoid. He was a man of impressive height and severe features, with dark hair touched with premature silver at the temples and eyes that held a depth of sorrow she recognized all too well. The gossip surrounding him was as persistent as that which followed her own scandal. His young duchess had died 3 years ago in a carriage accident, and rumor held that he blamed himself for her death, that they had quarreled before she departed on that fatal journey, that he had never properly said goodbye. "Your Grace," Marianne managed, attempting to compose herself despite her blotched face and obvious distress. "Please do not let me drive you away. I shall return to the ballroom." "No," Sebastian said firmly, and there was something in his voice that made her pause. "You should not. Not yet. Allow yourself a moment to breathe without the weight of their judgment." He stepped closer, and Marianne noticed for the first time that he held a glass of brandy in one hand and wore an expression of such profound weariness that it matched her own emotional exhaustion perfectly. Here was a man who understood the particular torture of navigating society while carrying a burden of pain too heavy to name. "You were escaping the festivities as well," Marianne observed quietly. "I find Christmas particularly difficult to endure," Sebastian admitted with surprising honesty. "The forced gaiety, the hollow well-wishes, the expectation that one should find joy in traditions that only serve to highlight what has been lost." He paused, studying her tear-stained face with eyes that held unexpected compassion. "Forgive me. You clearly have your own reasons for seeking refuge here, and I am hardly the appropriate person to offer comfort." "On the contrary," Marianne heard herself say, surprising herself with the words, "you may be the only person in all of London who truly understands." Something shifted in the Duke's expression. Recognition, perhaps, or acknowledgement of shared suffering. He moved to stand beside her, close enough for conversation but maintaining proper distance, and together they stared out through the conservatory glass at the darkness beyond. "I heard about what happened," Sebastian said after a long moment of silence. "At your wedding, Captain Thornton's unconscionable behavior, the circumstances of his desertion." He turned to look at her directly. "I am truly sorry for the pain you have endured. No one deserves such public humiliation." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her again. Marianne blinked rapidly, fighting back fresh tears. "Society believes I should have retired to our estate in Berkshire, that I should hide away in shame until the gossip subsides, which they assure me will occur in perhaps 5 or 10 years, provided nothing more scandalous occurs to replace my disgrace as the primary topic of conversation." "And yet you remain," Sebastian observed. "I refuse to be driven away," Marianne said with sudden fierce conviction. "I refuse to vanish simply because Miles Thornton proved himself an unprincipled rake. I refuse to grant these malicious onlookers the satisfaction of watching me retreat in defeat. My mother says I am being stubborn and foolish, that I am making everything worse by staying visible. But I cannot simply disappear. I will not. Sebastian was quiet for a moment, swirling the brandy in his glass with thoughtful deliberation. His reluctance was rooted in the knowledge of the incessant pressure from his family and the constant fear of being forced into an unwanted succession. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful. What if there were a way to silence the gossip without requiring you to flee London? A way to transform their pity and mockery into surprise and speculation? Marianne frowned, uncertain what he meant. I do not understand. I have a proposal, Sebastian said, and the formality of his tone suggested this was not an impulsive notion, but something he had been considering carefully. An arrangement that might benefit us both, if you would be willing to consider it. The Duke turned to face her fully, and in the shadowed conservatory, with Christmas carols drifting faintly from the distant ballroom, Sebastian Charles Rothermere made the most extraordinary suggestion Marianne Cordelia Summerfield had ever received. Allow me to court you, he said simply. Consider the facts. You are being hounded by pitying whispers and cruel mockery because society sees you as a rejected spinster. I am being relentlessly pursued by matchmaking mamas eager to see their daughters become the next Duchess of Lennox, despite my very clear lack of interest in remarrying. We could provide mutual protection through a temporary alliance. Marianne stared at him, certain she must have misheard. I beg your pardon? Precisely, Sebastian continued, his voice calm and rational despite the audacity of his proposal. We would appear together at social events for the remainder of the Christmas season. 3 weeks, perhaps 4. Long enough to establish the connection in society's mind, but not so long as to create expectations of a genuine betrothal. You would gain protection from the gossip surrounding your broken engagement. I would gain respite from the relentless pursuit of matrimony. When the arrangement concludes, we can part ways with a mutually agreed-upon explanation that maintains both our reputations intact. The suggestion was one of profound audacity, one of vast and uncharted possibility. And yet something in Marianne's bruised heart responded to the sheer audacity of the idea. She studied the Duke's face, searching for any hint of mockery or ulterior motive, but found only earnest sincerity in his dark eyes. Why would you do this? She asked. What do you truly gain from such an arrangement? Sebastian's expression softened slightly. Peace. An end to the constant pressure from my family and society to move on from my grief, to find a new duchess, to pretend that replacing what was lost is even possible. And perhaps, he added quietly, a small act of kindness towards someone who understands what it means to carry pain while performing normalcy for society's entertainment. The vulnerability in his admission struck something deep within Marianne's chest. Here was a man as wounded as herself, offering an alliance born not of romantic interest, but of mutual understanding and strategic necessity. It was the most honest proposal she had ever received, far more sincere than Miles Thornton's flowery declarations that had proven hollow at the first sign of difficulty. What would be the terms, Marianne asked carefully, if I were to agree to such an arrangement? Complete honesty between us at all times, Sebastian said immediately. No deception in our private interactions, even as we maintain the facade for others. Proper boundaries and respectful behavior befitting our stations. Either of us may end the arrangement at any time without questions or recriminations. And most importantly, we protect each other's reputations when the arrangement concludes. No scandal, no gossip, no harm to either party. Marianne found herself actually considering it. The thought of returning to that ballroom on the Duke of Lennox's arm, of watching the shock ripple through the assembled guests, of silencing Lady Caroline's cruel whispers with a single dramatic gesture, held undeniable appeal. More than that, the prospect of having an ally who truly understood her situation, who would not demand emotional intimacy she could not give, felt like a lifeline extended to a drowning woman. "One more condition," Marianne said. "When this arrangement ends, we must do so in a manner that protects both parties equally. No suggestion that either of us was at fault or lacking in any way. We shall simply discover we are not suited and part as friends. We must secure the arrangement in a way that safeguards both our futures." "Agreed," Sebastian said, extending his hand toward her. "Do we have an accord, Miss Summerfield?" Marianne looked at his offered hand, recognizing the enormity of what she was about to accept. This would change everything. There would be no going back once they walked into that ballroom together and announced their alliance to society. But perhaps that was precisely what she needed. Not to hide from the scandal, but to transform it into something new entirely. She placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his palm through both their gloves. "We have an accord, Your Grace." Sebastian's expression remained serious, but something like relief flickered across his features. "Then allow me to escort you back to the ballroom, Miss Summerfield. I believe we have a performance to begin." Together they walked from the conservatory, leaving the quiet sanctuary of exotic plants and honest conversation behind. As they approached the ballroom doors, Marianne could feel her heart racing with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She was about to do something either brilliantly strategic or monumentally foolish, and there was no way to know which until it was too late to change course. Sebastian paused just before they entered, looking down at her with unexpected gentleness. "Are you certain you wish to proceed? Once we cross this threshold together, the gossip will begin immediately." "I am certain," Marianne said, squaring her shoulders with renewed determination. "Let them gossip. For once, let them gossip about something other than my humiliation." The Duke offered his arm with courtly formality, and Marianne placed her hand upon it, feeling the solid strength beneath the expensive fabric of his evening coat. Then Sebastian Charles Rothermere, Duke of Lennox, the most reclusive nobleman in London, led Marianne Cordelia Summerfield, the most recent victim of society's mockery, through the ballroom doors and into full view of the assembled Christmas guests. The effect was immediate and profound. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Dancers stumbled in their patterns. Every eye in the vast space turned to watch as the Duke guided Marianne onto the dance floor just as the orchestra struck up a waltz. Lady Caroline Asherton's mouth actually fell open in shock. Lady Dorothea Sinclair dropped her fan. Even Lady Isabel Grayson, standing near the refreshment table with Captain Miles Thornton himself, newly returned from the continent, stared in obvious disbelief at the spectacle unfolding before them. Sebastian placed his hand at Marianne's waist with perfect propriety, his other hand clasping hers with gentle firmness. As the music swelled and they began to move together across the floor, he leaned close enough that only she could hear his whispered words. "Smile, Miss Summerfield. Let them see that you are not defeated. Let them wonder what power you possess that has drawn the attention of a duke who has refused every advance for 3 years." Marianne looked up into his face and allowed herself to smile, genuinely and brilliantly, for the first time in 2 months. Not because she felt particularly joyful, but because the sheer audacity of this moment, the theatrical perfection of it, struck her as almost funny. Here she was, dancing at a Christmas ball with a grieving duke in a fake courtship designed to protect them both from society's cruelty. And it was working better than she could have possibly imagined. "They look absolutely scandalized," Marianne murmured as they swept past a cluster of gaping matrons. "Indeed," Sebastian replied, and there was the faintest hint of satisfaction in his voice. Mission accomplished. As they continued to dance, moving together with surprising ease considering they had never partnered before, Marianne felt something shift inside her chest. Not love, certainly not that, but perhaps the first stirring of hope that her life might contain possibilities beyond endless humiliation and social exile. Perhaps with this unlikely alliance, she might survive after all. The waltz concluded, and Sebastian led her from the floor with impeccable courtesy. He guided her to a quieter corner of the ballroom, positioning himself slightly in front of her as a barrier against the curious stares and approaching gossips. His presence was protective without being possessive, a shield she desperately needed. "Your Grace," a familiar voice said, and Marianne's stomach dropped as she recognized Lady Vivian Rothermere, Sebastian's mother and the Dowager Duchess of Lennox. The elegant woman approached with the bearing of someone accustomed to unquestioned authority, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her burgundy gown immaculate. Her sharp eyes moved from her son to Marianne with unconcealed curiosity. "Mother," Sebastian acknowledged with respectful inclination of his head, "may I present Miss Marianne Cordelia Summerfield, daughter of Baron Summerfield of Berkshire. Miss Summerfield, my mother, Lady Vivian Rothermere, Dowager Duchess of Lennox." Marianne executed her deepest curtsy, her heart pounding. This was the first true test of their arrangement. If the Dowager Duchess openly disapproved or questioned their sudden connection, the entire plan would crumble before it properly began. "Miss Summerfield," Lady Vivian said, her tone meticulously guarded. "How delightful to make your acquaintance. I confess myself surprised to see my son dancing this evening. He has refused every invitation to take the floor these past 3 years." "Miss Summerfield is an exceptional conversationalist," Sebastian said smoothly. "We met in the conservatory earlier and discovered a shared appreciation for botanical specimens. I found her company so engaging that I could not resist requesting a dance." It was a masterful deflection, plausible enough to satisfy curiosity without revealing the true nature of their arrangement. Lady Vivian's expression remained inscrutable, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been approval or might have been calculation. "Indeed," the Dowager Duchess said. "How fortunate. Miss Summerfield, I wonder if you and your family might join us for tea tomorrow afternoon at our residence in Berkeley Square? I would very much enjoy continuing our acquaintance." It was not truly an invitation, Marianne recognized. It was a summons. The Dowager Duchess intended to evaluate her properly, away from the chaos of a Christmas ball, to determine whether this sudden connection between her reclusive son and the scandal-ridden daughter of a minor baron warranted her support or her intervention. "We would be honored, Your Grace," Marianne said, maintaining her composure despite her racing thoughts. "My mother will be delighted to accept your kind invitation." "Excellent," Lady Vivian replied. "Until tomorrow, then. Sebastian, I trust you will escort Miss Summerfield safely back to her family." "Of course, Mother." As the Dowager Duchess glided away, leaving a trail of whispered speculation in her wake, Marianne allowed herself to breathe again. Sebastian looked down at her with something that might have been amusement. "You handled that beautifully," he said quietly. "My mother is not easily impressed, but I believe you may have passed her initial examination." "Your mother terrifies me," Marianne admitted with complete honesty. "She terrifies most people," Sebastian replied. "It is one of her most effective qualities." He guided her back across the ballroom toward where her own family stood clustered near the entrance. Marianne's mother, Lady Helena Summerfield, looked as though she might faint from shock at any moment. Her father, Baron Reginald Summerfield, appeared equally stunned, but attempted to maintain his dignity as the Duke of Lennox approached. "Baron Summerfield, Lady Summerfield," Sebastian said, with perfect courtesy. "I wonder if I might have your permission to call upon Miss Summerfield tomorrow morning. I find myself eager to continue our conversation about literature and natural philosophy." Marianne's father was the first to recover his voice. "Your Grace, we would be most honored." "Most honored indeed. Marianne, dear, will you be at home to receive callers tomorrow?" "Of course, Father," Marianne said, maintaining the performance even as she saw the confusion and hope warring in her mother's expression. Sebastian bowed formally to them all, then took Marianne's hand and raised it to his lips in a gesture that sent fresh ripples of gossip through the watching crowd. His lips never quite touched her glove, maintaining absolute propriety, but the symbolic nature of the gesture was clear to everyone observing. "Until tomorrow, Miss Summerfield," he said. "I shall count the hours." Then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd with the same quiet authority he had displayed throughout the evening. Marianne stood beside her stunned parents, acutely aware of every eye upon her, every whispered speculation, every calculation being made about this sudden and completely unexpected development. "Marianne," her mother breathed, gripping her arm with trembling fingers. "What just happened? How did you come to meet the Duke of Lennox? Why would he pay you such marked attention?" "We spoke in the conservatory," Marianne replied calmly, sticking to Sebastian's established explanation. "We discovered shared interests. He asked me to dance, that is all. But it was not all, and everyone in that ballroom knew it. The Duke of Lennox did not dance. He did not engage in courtship. He did not show interest in any young lady, no matter how beautiful or well-connected. For him to single out Marianne Summerfield, of all people, suggested something extraordinary was occurring." Let them speculate, Marianne thought with a surge of satisfaction. Let them whisper and wonder. For once, the gossip would be about her potential triumph rather than her public humiliation. For once, she would be the subject of envy rather than pity. As her family prepared to depart, collecting cloaks and saying goodbyes, Marianne caught sight of Lady Isabel Grayson across the ballroom. The woman who had stolen her, intended, stood staring at Marianne with an expression of pure disbelief mixed with something that looked remarkably like jealousy. Captain Miles Thornton stood beside Isabel, looking uncomfortable and somehow diminished, as though the bloom of their scandalous romance had already begun to fade. Marianne allowed herself one final smile in their direction before turning away. Whatever pain Miles had caused her, whatever humiliation she had endured standing alone at that altar, suddenly seemed less significant. She had survived the worst moment of her life, and now, through an unlikely alliance with a grieving duke, she was discovering that survival could transform into something far more powerful. Revenge was too strong a word, perhaps, but vindication felt precisely right. The Summerfield carriage carried them home through the lamplit streets of Mayfair, and Marianne pressed her forehead against the cool window glass, watching the Christmas decorations glow in windows they passed. Her mother chattered excitedly beside her, already planning what dress Marianne should wear for tomorrow's morning call, what topics she should discuss, how she should comport herself to maintain the Duke's interest. Marianne let the words wash over her without truly listening. She was thinking instead about Sebastian's dark eyes, about the sorrow she had recognized there, about the strange comfort of his honest proposal. This arrangement was built on pragmatism rather than romance, on mutual protection rather than passion. There would be no grand declarations of love, no dramatic gestures beyond those required for public performance. And somehow, that made it safer, easier, less likely to shatter her already fractured heart. She wondered what Sebastian was thinking now, whether he was already regretting his impulsive offer, whether he too was lying awake in the darkness, questioning the wisdom of their agreement. But even if he regretted it, Marianne knew she did not. For the first time since that terrible morning when she had stood in her wedding gown, waiting for a groom who would never appear, she felt something other than despair. She felt possibility. The next morning arrived with pale winter sunlight struggling through gray clouds. Marianne stood before her mirror while her lady's maid, Grace, arranged her hair in an elegant chignon adorned with small pearl pins. She had chosen a morning dress of soft lavender wool, appropriate for receiving callers, yet flattering enough to suggest she had made some effort with her appearance. "You look lovely, miss," Grace said softly, adjusting one final curl. The girl had been Marianne's maid since she was 16 and had witnessed every moment of the wedding day disaster. She alone knew the full extent of Marianne's pain. "If I may say so, miss, it does my heart good to see you looking hopeful again." "I am not certain I would call it hope," Marianne replied honestly. "But perhaps I am less resigned to misery than I was yesterday." "That is something, miss. That is definitely something." The Duke arrived precisely at 11 o'clock, announced by their butler with barely concealed excitement. Marianne descended the stairs to find her parents already in the morning room, her mother wearing her best day dress and an expression of barely suppressed glee. Her father looked more cautious, as though he suspected this sudden attention from a duke might dissipate at any moment. Sebastian stood as she entered, and Marianne was struck anew by his commanding presence. In the morning light, she could see the lines of weariness around his eyes, the threads of silver in his dark hair that spoke of sleepless nights and carried grief. He was not classically handsome in the way Miles Thornton had been, with his golden curls and charming smile. Sebastian's appeal was different, quieter, rooted in depth rather than surface attraction. "Miss Summerfield," he said with a formal bow, "you look exceptionally well this morning." "Your Grace," Marianne replied with an appropriate curtsy. "Thank you for calling." The conversation that followed was carefully orchestrated for her parents' benefit. They discussed literature, touching on recent publications and classic works. They spoke of botanical interests, with Sebastian demonstrating impressive knowledge of exotic plant species. They mentioned shared appreciation for music, though both admitted to being more enthusiastic listeners than performers. All the while, Marianne was acutely aware that this was performance. Every word carefully chosen, every gesture deliberately calculated to suggest growing affection without promising anything definite. It was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. After the socially appropriate length of time for a morning call, Sebastian rose to depart. "Miss Summerfield, I wonder if you would do me the honor of accompanying me on a drive through Hyde Park this afternoon. The weather appears clement enough for a brief outing." "I would be delighted, Your Grace," Marianne replied, ignoring her mother's sharp intake of breath. A carriage drive in Hyde Park during the promenade hour was tantamount to a public announcement of courtship. "Excellent. I shall call for you at 3 o'clock if that proves convenient." After Sebastian departed, Lady Helena practically trembled with excitement. "A drive through Hyde Park during the fashionable hour. Marianne, do you understand what this means? The Duke of Lennox has not been seen driving with any young lady since his wife's death. This is extraordinary, simply extraordinary." "Mother, please," Marianne said gently. "We must not allow ourselves to become overly excited. His Grace and I are merely becoming acquainted. Nothing more has been established." Bah, but her mother was already planning what pelisse Marianne should wear, what bonnet would be most becoming, how she should arrange her hair. Marianne allowed herself to be swept along in the preparations, all while maintaining a careful internal distance from the proceedings. This was not real, she reminded herself. This was strategy, protection, a mutually beneficial arrangement that would conclude in a few weeks with both parties unharmed. She must not allow herself to forget that essential fact, no matter how convincing their public performance became. At precisely 3 o'clock, Sebastian's elegant curricle appeared before the Summerfield townhouse. The vehicle was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, all gleaming black lacquer and brass fittings, pulled by a matched pair of chestnuts that looked as though they could win any race in England. Sebastian himself drove, which indicated he intended this to be a more intimate outing than a formal carriage ride with grooms and chaperones would provide. Marianne descended the front steps, wearing a deep blue pelisse over her lavender dress, a matching bonnet framing her face, and the warmest gloves she owned. December in London was bitterly cold, but she would endure far worse weather for the opportunity to complete this crucial public appearance. Sebastian assisted her into the curricle with perfect courtesy, his hands steady and his touch brief. Once she was settled, he took his own seat and gathered the reins with practiced ease, and the horses stepped forward smoothly, joining the stream of traffic heading toward Hyde Park. "How are you managing?" Sebastian asked once they were away from her parents' hearing. His voice had lost the formal quality it carried in their public interactions, becoming warmer and more genuine. "I realize this arrangement requires considerable acting ability." "I am managing well enough," Marianne replied honestly. "Though I confess, I found this morning's performance more challenging than last night's waltz. Sustaining conversation while maintaining the appearance of budding romance proved more difficult than I anticipated." "You were flawless," Sebastian assured her. "Your parents were entirely convinced. though I find the notion that I am so readily swayed by a morning call rather amusing. My mother is convinced I am about to become a duchess, Marianne observed with a quiet irony. I fear she will be terribly disappointed when our arrangement concludes. Sebastian was quiet for a moment, guiding the horses through a turn with casual expertise. We shall manage that carefully when the time comes. I have already considered how best to end this arrangement without damaging either of our reputations. We shall discover we are not well suited. Our interests diverge. We part as friends with mutual respect intact. That sounds reasonable, Marianne agreed, though something in her chest tightened at the clinical nature of planning their eventual separation. They entered Hyde Park through the Cumberland Gate, and immediately Marianne became aware of the attention their arrival generated. Carriages slowed, riders turned in their saddles, pedestrians paused on the walking paths. The Duke of Lennox was driving with a lady, and that lady was none other than Miss Marianne Summerfield, the woman who had been left at the altar just 2 months prior. "Steady," Sebastian murmured, clearly sensing her tension. "Remember why we are doing this. Let them see that you are not broken. Let them see that you have captured the interest of a man who has rejected every advance for 3 years." Marianne lifted her chin and allowed herself to meet the curious stares with calm dignity. Yes, she wanted to tell them all. "Look at me. I survived your pity and your mockery. I am still here. And now I ride beside a duke while you scramble to revise your opinions and judgments." They made the circuit of Rotten Row at a measured pace, acknowledging acquaintances with appropriate nods, but not stopping for extended conversation. Sebastian maintained a posture of attentive courtesy toward her, occasionally leaning closer as though sharing private observations, creating an atmosphere of developing intimacy that was entirely for public consumption. "I must confess something," Sebastian said quietly as they completed their circuit and turned toward a less crowded path. "I am finding this arrangement less difficult than I anticipated." "Oh?" Marianne glanced at him curiously. "Your company is actually quite pleasant," he said with a slight smile. "I had prepared myself for the awkwardness of manufacturing conversation with a stranger. Instead, I find I rather enjoy talking with you. Your observations are intelligent, and your wit is sharp. These are not qualities I encounter frequently in society." The compliment caught Marianne off guard. She had grown so accustomed to dismissiveness and pity that genuine appreciation felt foreign and somewhat alarming. "Thank you, Your Grace. I find your company equally agreeable." "Sebastian," he corrected gently. "When we are private, I think we might dispense with excessive formality. We are partners in this endeavor after all." "Sebastian," Marianne tested his name carefully. "And you may call me Marianne, if you wish." "Marianne," he repeated, and something about the way he said her name with quiet respect rather than mocking familiarity made her chest feel warm despite the December cold. They drove in companionable silence for a while, and Marianne found herself actually relaxing in his presence. There was no pressure to perform perfectly, no fear of judgment, no worry that he might find her lacking and abandon her as Miles had done. This was an agreement between equals, built on mutual understanding rather than romantic expectation. In its own way, it felt safer than any genuine courtship could be. "May I ask you something personal?" Marianne ventured after a few minutes. "About your late wife?" Sebastian's expression tightened slightly, but he did not refuse. "You may ask." "Is it true that you quarreled before her accident? The rumors say you blame yourself for her death." "Rumors are frequently more accurate than one might wish," Sebastian replied quietly. His hands tightened on the reins, though the horses maintained their steady pace. "Anne and I argued that morning, about something utterly trivial. I cannot even remember what sparked the disagreement. She left in anger, taking the carriage to visit her sister. The wheel struck a rut on the road, the carriage overturned, and she died before I could reach her. I never had the opportunity to apologize, never told her how much I loved her despite our quarrel, never said goodbye. The pain in his voice was raw and genuine, and Marianne felt her heart contract with sympathy. "I am so very sorry." 3 years, Sebastian continued, as though now that he had begun speaking, the words needed to pour out. 3 years of living with the knowledge that our last words were spoken in anger. 3 years of wondering if things might have been different had I been kinder, more patient, less concerned with my own pride. The guilt is a constant companion. "You cannot blame yourself for an accident," Marianne said gently. "Can I not?" Sebastian's smile was bitter. "Society certainly does. They whisper that I drove her away with my cold nature, my inability to express affection properly. And perhaps they are correct. Perhaps if I had been a better husband, she would not have been fleeing my presence when fate intervened." Marianne reached out impulsively and placed her gloved hand on his arm. "You are not responsible for what happened. Accidents occur regardless of our wishes or our guilt. She would not want you to torment yourself this way." "How can you know what she would want?" Sebastian asked, though his voice held curiosity rather than challenge. "Because I lost someone too," Marianne replied. "Not through death, but through betrayal. And I know that carrying guilt and blame serves no purpose except to keep us trapped in the past. Your Anne would want you to live, Sebastian, to find whatever happiness remains possible, to forgive yourself." They had reached a secluded section of the park, sheltered by tall trees that provided privacy from curious observers. Sebastian pulled the horses to a stop and turned to look at Marianne directly. In his eyes, she saw the same wounded recognition she had glimpsed the night before in the conservatory. "You understand," he said simply. "I understand," Marianne confirmed. "We are both haunted by ghosts of our own making. Mine is a man who proved himself unworthy. Yours is a woman you loved and lost. But we are still here, Sebastian, still breathing, still trying to survive in a world that seems determined to judge us for our pain." "Is that why you agreed to this arrangement?" Sebastian asked. "Not merely for protection from gossip, but because you recognized a kindred spirit?" Marianne considered the question carefully before answering. "Perhaps. I think I agreed because you offered me honesty in a world built on deception. You did not pretend to offer love or romance. You offered partnership and protection and truth. After Miles's betrayal, those qualities hold more value than any declaration of eternal devotion ever could." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as though seeing her clearly for the first time. Then he smiled, and it transformed his severe features into something warmer, more approachable. "I believe this arrangement may have been the wisest decision either of us has made in quite some time, Marianne." "I find myself inclined to agree," she replied, returning his smile with genuine pleasure. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, suggesting they should return before impropriety became a concern. Sebastian guided the curricle back toward the main paths, and they rejoined the flow of society's daily parade. But something had shifted between them during their private conversation. What had begun as pure performance now contained a thread of authentic connection, fragile but undeniably present. They were not falling in love, Marianne told herself firmly. They were simply two wounded people finding comfort in shared understanding. That was all. That was enough. It had to be enough, because allowing herself to hope for anything more would be inviting disaster. But as Sebastian returned her to her family's townhouse and bid her farewell with another courtly gesture that sent her mother into fresh paroxysms of delight, Marianne could not quite suppress the small ember of warmth that had taken root in her chest. For the first time in months, she was looking forward to tomorrow rather than merely enduring today. That evening brought the promised tea at the Dowager Duchess's residence in Berkeley Square. The Rothermere London house was magnificent, all classical proportions and elegant furnishings that spoke of generations of wealth and taste. Lady Vivienne presided over the gathering with the authority of a queen holding court, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she evaluated Marianne and her mother. Sebastian was present as well, providing subtle support through occasional encouraging glances. His younger sister, Lady Charlotte Rothermere, had also joined them, a lively young woman of 19, with her brother's dark coloring and her mother's penetrating gaze. "Miss Summerfield," Charlotte said warmly, settling beside Marianne on an elegant settee. "I am so pleased to meet you. Sebastian has spoken of little else since last night's ball." I confess myself astonished, as he typically avoids discussing anything remotely related to social events. "Your brother has been most kind," Marianne replied carefully, aware that every word would be analyzed. "Kind is not typically how one describes Sebastian," Charlotte said with affectionate irreverence. "Brooding, certainly. Scholarly, undoubtedly. But kind suggests a warmth he has not displayed since Anne's death. Until now, apparently." Lady Vivian cleared her throat delicately, a clear signal that Charlotte was venturing into inappropriate territory. The younger woman subsided with a slight pout, but her eyes remained curious and friendly. The tea proceeded according to strict protocol, with conversation touching on appropriately neutral topics. But beneath the surface pleasantries, Marianne was acutely aware of being assessed. Lady Vivian was determining whether she represented a genuine threat to her son's continued mourning or merely a temporary distraction that would fade with the season. It was only as they were preparing to depart that Lady Vivian drew Marianne aside for a brief private word. "Miss Summerfield, I would speak plainly with you, if I may." "Of course, Your Grace," Marianne replied, bracing herself for whatever judgment was coming. "My son has suffered greatly these past 3 years," the Dowager Duchess said quietly. "The guilt he carries has nearly destroyed him. If your attentions toward him are genuine, then I welcome your presence in his life. But if you seek merely to exploit his title and position for your own social rehabilitation, I will ensure you regret such manipulation most severely." The threat was delivered with perfect politeness, but it was unmistakably a threat nonetheless. Marianne met Lady Vivian's gaze directly, refusing to be intimidated. "Your Grace, I assure you I have no intention of causing your son harm. My own situation has taught me the value of honesty and the danger of false pretenses. Whatever develops between Sebastian and myself will be built on truth, not deception." It was as close to revealing their actual arrangement as Marianne dared venture. Lady Vivian studied her for a long moment, then gave a slight nod of what might have been approval. "I believe you mean that, Miss Summerfield. Very well. You have my cautious blessing to continue your acquaintance with my son, but know that I shall be watching closely." "I would expect nothing less from a devoted mother," Marianne replied with sincere respect. As the Summerfields returned home through the darkening London streets, Marianne reflected on the day's events. She had successfully navigated 2 crucial encounters, establishing herself in both public and private spheres as someone worthy of the Duke of Lennox's attention. The arrangement was proceeding exactly as planned. So why did she feel increasingly uncertain about where performance ended and genuine emotion began? The following days passed in a whirlwind of social obligations carefully orchestrated to maximize the visibility of their courtship. Sebastian called at the Summerfield residence every morning, each visit lasting precisely the appropriate duration. They attended an evening soirée together, where Sebastian remained at Marianne's side with marked attention, discouraging other gentlemen from approaching while sending clear signals of his claimed interest. They visited the theater one evening, occupying Sebastian's private box where society could observe them sitting close together, apparently engrossed in conversation during the intervals. In truth, they discussed everything from current politics to philosophical questions about duty versus desire, finding unexpected common ground in their views. On the 28th of December, Sebastian took Marianne ice skating at a private party hosted by one of his cousins. The frozen pond was surrounded by torches that cast dancing shadows across the ice, and the air rang with laughter and the scrape of blades against the frozen surface. Marianne had not skated in years, and her first tentative steps onto the ice were unsteady. Sebastian skated backward with effortless grace, his hands extended to steady her. "Trust me," he said with a smile. "I will not let you fall." And he did not. For more than an hour, they glided across the ice together, Sebastian's strong hands supporting her as she relearned the rhythm of skating. There was something intimate about the necessity of physical contact, the way she had to rely on his strength and trust his guidance. When she finally began to regain her confidence, moving more freely under her own power, she looked up to find Sebastian watching her with an expression she could not quite interpret. "What is it?" Marianne asked, breathless from exertion and cold. "You look happy," Sebastian said simply. "Genuinely happy. I do not believe I have seen that expression on your face before." Marianne realized with surprise that he was correct. For these few moments, skating on a frozen pond under torchlight with Sebastian's hands steadying her, she had forgotten to maintain her careful guard. She had allowed herself to simply experience joy without analyzing or guarding her own spirit. "I am happy," she admitted, the words feeling strange and wonderful on her tongue. "I did not expect to feel this way again. Thank you for giving me this." "You have given me something as well," Sebastian replied quietly. "You have reminded me that life continues, that there can be moments of lightness even in the midst of grief. I had forgotten that was possible." They stood together on the ice, hands still joined, and something passed between them that felt dangerous and thrilling and utterly unplanned. This was supposed to be performance, strategy, mutual protection. But in that moment, with frost sparkling on Sebastian's dark hair and his eyes reflecting torchlight, Marianne felt the first stirrings of something that might become real if she was not extremely careful. She pulled away gently, breaking the spell. "We should return to the warming tent. My fingers are growing numb despite these gloves." "Of course," Sebastian agreed, but she thought she detected disappointment in his voice. The days leading to the new year passed with increasing complexity. What should have been simple public appearances began to feel weighted with unspoken possibility. Sebastian's touches, while always proper, seemed to linger fractionally longer. Marianne found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that had nothing to do with strategic advantage and everything to do with genuine pleasure in his company. They spoke of things she had never discussed with Miles during their entire courtship. Sebastian shared his struggles with managing his estates, his frustrations with political obligations, his fears about failing those who depended upon him. Marianne confessed her own anxieties about her uncertain future, her complicated relationship with her mother, her secret love of poetry that she had always hidden for fear of seeming pretentious. On the 31st of December, the Fairfax family hosted their annual New Year's Eve ball, the most anticipated event of the Christmas season. Marianne dressed with particular care, wearing a gown of deep midnight blue that made her eyes appear almost violet in candlelight. Her mother had insisted on lending her the family sapphires, delicate drops that caught the light with every movement. Sebastian arrived to escort them personally, an honor that sent Lady Helena into fresh raptures. But when his gaze fell upon Marianne descending the stairs, something flickered in his expression that made her breath catch. It was not the look of a man engaged in strategic performance. It was the look of a man genuinely struck by what he saw. "You look extraordinary," Sebastian said quietly as she reached the bottom step. "Thank you," Marianne managed, disconcerted by the sincerity in his voice. The Fairfax ball was a crush of bodies and noise and blazing candlelight. Sebastian guided Marianne through the crowds with protective attentiveness, his hand at the small of her back, a constant presence she was growing far too accustomed to feeling. They danced the first waltz together, moving as though they had been partnering for years rather than days. It was during the second waltz, as midnight approached and the excitement in the ballroom reached fever pitch, that everything changed. Sebastian held her closer than strict propriety allowed, their bodies moving in perfect synchronization. The music swelled around them, but Marianne was aware only of Sebastian's hand at her waist, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her heart race. "Marianne," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that sounded like warning, or confession, or prayer. "Sebastian," she replied, barely breathing. "This arrangement of ours," he continued, still moving them through the patterns of the waltz. "It was meant to be temporary, protection for us both, nothing more." "Yes," Marianne agreed, though her voice wavered slightly. "I find myself struggling to remember that," Sebastian admitted. "When I am with you, when we talk or dance, I forget that this is a performance. It begins to feel real, Marianne. It feels dangerously real." Her heart was hammering so loudly, she was certain he must hear it. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too." The confession hung between them, acknowledged but terrifying. They had crossed some invisible line from pretense into genuine emotion, and neither of them seemed certain how to navigate this new territory. "How do we navigate this unexpected current, Sebastian?" Marianne asked. "I do not know," Sebastian replied. "I am afraid, Marianne, terribly afraid of caring again, of losing again, terribly afraid that my heart's capacity for affection brings only ruin. And I am afraid of trusting after betrayal," Marianne said, "afraid of mistaking comfort for love, afraid of risking my affection upon something that was never meant to be permanent." They continued dancing, trapped in their waltz and their mutual fear, neither willing to name what was growing between them, but both acutely aware of its presence. The music ended just as the clock began to strike midnight, and around them, guests erupted in celebration of the new year. 1815 had arrived. Sebastian did not release her immediately. Instead, he stood with her in the middle of the dance floor, hands still joined, as revelers shouted and embraced around them. "Happy New Year, Marianne," he said quietly. "Happy New Year, Sebastian," she replied. And in that moment, with the old year ending and the new beginning, Marianne realized with absolute certainty that their arrangement had become something far more complicated than either of them had intended. The following days brought an unexpected complication that threw their carefully balanced situation into chaos. On the 5th of January, Captain Miles Thornton returned from the continent and immediately sought a private conference with Marianne. She received him in the morning room with her mother present as chaperone, though Lady Helena looked ready to order him bodily removed from the premises. Miles looked travel-worn and nervous, his former confidence notably diminished. "Miss Summerfield," he began without preamble. "Marianne, I have come to explain, to apologize, to beg your forgiveness if possible." "I am listening," Marianne said coolly, maintaining rigid control over her emotions. "I was drowning in gambling debts, debts I had concealed from everyone, including you. Isabel's father offered to pay them in exchange for my marrying her. He wanted a connection to military prestige, and I needed rescue from ruin. I am ashamed beyond words, Marianne. What I did to you was unconscionable." "Yes," Marianne agreed calmly. "It was." Miles seemed taken aback by her composure. "I thought you would be more upset, more angry. The gossip suggested you were devastated, yet you seem remarkably recovered." "I was devastated," Marianne replied with complete honesty. "You humiliated me publicly and broke my heart privately. But I have since learned that your departure, while painful, may have been the greatest gift you could have given me. You showed me who you truly were before I bound myself to you forever. For that, I suppose I should thank you." "Thank me?" Miles repeated, clearly bewildered. "You freed me to discover what true partnership might look like," Marianne continued. "What honest communication and mutual respect feel like. What it means to be with someone who values my mind as well as my social position. You could never have given me those things, Miles. You were too concerned with maintaining your own comfort to consider anyone else's needs." Lady Helena made a small sound that might have been approval or surprise. "Are you saying you have formed an attachment elsewhere?" he asked. "I am saying that whether or not I have formed attachments is no longer any concern of yours," Marianne replied firmly. "You made your choice on our wedding day. I am now making mine. I forgive you, Captain Thornton, because carrying anger toward you serves no purpose. Forgiveness means releasing you from my thoughts entirely." Miles stood awkwardly for a moment longer, clearly having expected a very different reception. "I wish you well then, Miss Summerfield. Truly, I do." "And I wish you wisdom in future endeavors," Marianne replied with cool courtesy. After he departed, Lady Helena stared at her daughter with undisguised wonder. "When did you become so strong, my dear? When did you develop such extraordinary composure?" "When I learned that survival requires letting go of what cannot be changed," Marianne replied. "And when I discovered that I deserve better than men who view me as merely convenient." What she did not say, what she barely dared acknowledge even to herself, was that Miles's return had clarified something crucial. She felt nothing for him, no residual affection, no lingering hurt, no desire for vengeance. He had become irrelevant to her emotional landscape, but Sebastian had become essential, and that realization terrified her. That evening, Sebastian called unexpectedly, arriving well after appropriate visiting hours, but clearly unable to wait until morning. Marianne met him in the drawing room with only her maid present as chaperone, curiosity and concern warring within her. "I heard that Thornton called today," Sebastian said without preamble. "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," Marianne assured him. "He came to apologize and explain. I accepted his apology and dismissed him from my life entirely." "Good," Sebastian said fiercely. "He deserves no consideration from you." "Sebastian," Marianne began carefully, "when Miles was here, when he was standing before me making his excuses, I realized something important. I realized my emotional landscape was quite changed." "What did you realize?" "That I feel nothing for him whatsoever. No anger, no hurt, no lingering attachment. He has become merely an unfortunate memory. Nothing more." She paused, gathering her courage. "But I also realized that I feel a great deal toward someone else. Someone I never intended to care for. Someone who was supposed to be only a strategic alliance," she finished, her voice steady despite her emotions. Sebastian went very still. "Marianne." "I know," she said quickly. "I know this was not part of our agreement. I know I have transgressed the very foundation we established. But I cannot continue pretending that my feelings toward you are merely gratitude or friendship. They have become something more, Sebastian. Something real and frightening and entirely unexpected." For a long moment, Sebastian said nothing. He simply stood in the center of her drawing room, looking at her with an expression of such complex emotion she could not begin to interpret it. Then, slowly, he crossed the space between them. "Do you know why I agreed to this arrangement?" he asked quietly. "Why I offered to court you when I had refused every other opportunity for 3 years?" "To escape the relentless pursuit of matrimony," Marianne replied, though she suddenly doubted that simple explanation. "That was part of it," Sebastian admitted. "But there was more. When I saw you in that conservatory, crying and broken, and yet still determined to survive with dignity, I recognized something of myself. I saw a woman who had every reason to surrender to despair, but chose defiance instead. I saw strength I had lost sight of in myself, and I wanted to help you, yes, but I was compelled to be near that strength, to remind myself that survival was possible." "Sebastian," Marianne whispered. "I told myself it was strategic," he continued. "I told myself I was being practical and helpful. But the truth, Marianne, is that I was drawn to you from that first moment. Your intelligence, your resilience, your capacity to find humor even in pain. Everything about you calls to something in me that I thought had died with Anne." "Are you saying," Marianne began, hardly daring to hope. "I am saying that I have given my heart to you, Marianne," Sebastian said. "Not in rash passion, but in measured and sincere esteem. I love you because you are extraordinary, and you have shown me that my heart is still capable of feeling. But I am afraid, Marianne, terribly afraid of caring again, of losing again. Terribly afraid that my heart's capacity for affection brings only ruin. She struggled to maintain her composure. You are not responsible for what happened to Anne, and I am not her. I am here, Sebastian. I am real, and I love you too, desperately and foolishly and completely. He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to retreat, and cupped her face in his hands with infinite gentleness. Are you certain? Once we acknowledge this, once we make it real, there is no returning to the safety of pretense. I am certain, Marianne said firmly. I do not want pretense anymore, Sebastian. I want truth. I want you. I want whatever future we might build together, regardless of how terrifying it might be. Sebastian leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, their breaths momentarily uniting. They stood like that for a long moment, trembling on the threshold of something vast and uncharted possibility. And then he kissed her. It was nothing like the chaste kisses Miles had stolen during their courtship. This was deeper, more profound, filled with all the emotion they had been carefully suppressing for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily, and Sebastian looked as shaken as Marianne felt. I should ask your father's permission, Sebastian said in a low, earnest tone. I should do this properly, with all appropriate ceremony and protocol. Yes, Marianne agreed. You should. Tomorrow, Sebastian promised. I shall speak with him tomorrow and make my intentions clear. No more pretense, Marianne. No more strategic alliance. Only honest courtship leading toward honest marriage, if you will have me. I will have you, Marianne replied with absolute certainty. In whatever form you offer yourself, Sebastian, I will have you. He kissed her again, briefly but with fierce possession, then forced himself to step back. I should leave before I compromise you entirely. Your maid is doing her best to pretend she has not witnessed this entire exchange, but I suspect her discretion has limits. Marianne glanced over and saw Grace studiously examining the curtain fabric as though it held secrets of the universe. She laughed despite her tears. Tomorrow, then. Tomorrow, Sebastian confirmed. Sleep well, my love. Dream of happy futures and second chances. After he departed, Marianne sank onto the settee, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Grace hurried over with smelling salts, but Marianne waved them away. I am well, Grace. Better than well. I am happy. Yes, miss, Grace said with a knowing smile. I can see that quite clearly. That night, Marianne lay in her bed unable to sleep, her mind racing with the extraordinary turn her life had taken. 2 months ago, she had stood at an altar, abandoned and humiliated, certain her life was effectively over. Now she lay here, loved by a duke who had shown her that survival could transform into triumph, that strategic protection could become genuine affection, that Christmas miracles might actually exist. She touched her lips, still feeling the phantom pressure of Sebastian's kiss, and allowed herself to believe in possibilities she had thought forever lost. Tomorrow would bring formal declarations and family consultations and all the machinery of proper courtship. But tonight, she simply existed in the warm glow of mutual confession and newfound hope. The 6th of January dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter morning where frost painted intricate patterns on windows and breath became visible clouds. Marianne dressed with particular care, knowing this was the day everything would become official. No more pretense, no more strategic alliance, only honest commitment. Sebastian arrived before noon, requesting a private conference with Baron Summerfield. The two men closeted themselves in the study for nearly an hour while Marianne and her mother waited anxiously in the morning room. Lady Helena practically trembled with nervous excitement, clutching Marianne's hand with almost painful intensity. When the study door finally opened, both men emerged looking satisfied. Baron Summerfield's expression held unexpected respect, while Sebastian looked quietly triumphant. They approached the morning room together, and Marianne rose to her feet, heart hammering. Marianne, her father said with unusual formality. "His Grace has done me the honor of requesting your hand in marriage. I have given my consent, pending your agreement. He has also presented an exceptionally generous marriage settlement," Lady Helena added with evident gratification. "Most generous indeed." Sebastian crossed to Marianne and took her hand, looking down at her with such open affection that she felt tears threatening again. She struggled to maintain her composure. "Miss Summerfield, Marianne, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Not as part of any arrangement or strategy, but because I love you and wish to spend my remaining days making you as happy as you have made me?" "Yes," Marianne said simply, her voice steady despite her emotions. "Yes, Sebastian, I will marry you." He produced a ring from his pocket, a stunning sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the morning light in brilliant flashes. "This ring belonged to my grandmother, a woman whose spirit I find mirrored in your own. I can think of no one more worthy to wear it." The ring slid onto Marianne's finger as though made for her hand. She stared at it, this tangible symbol of promises and possibilities, and felt overwhelmed by the improbable journey that had brought her to this moment. The news spread through London society with astonishing speed and inevitable consequence. By evening, the announcement had appeared in the papers. By the following morning, the Summerfield residence was overwhelmed by callers offering congratulations, many of whom had been among the cruelest gossips just weeks earlier. Lady Caroline Asherton came to call, all false smiles and insincere pleasure. "My dear Miss Summerfield, I am simply thrilled for you. Such an unexpected triumph after such unfortunate circumstances." Marianne received her with cool courtesy. "Thank you, Lady Caroline. I find that life often surprises us in the most delightful ways." Even Lady Isabel Grayson appeared, though she could barely conceal her jealousy beneath a veneer of politeness. "I wish you joy, Miss Summerfield, though I confess myself shocked that the Duke overcame his grief so thoroughly." "The Duke's grief remains a private matter," Marianne replied firmly. "But he has learned that honoring the past does not require abandoning the future. I am fortunate that he chose to share that future with me." After Isabel departed, Sebastian arrived for his daily visit. They had fallen into a comfortable routine of spending hours together, talking and planning, and slowly building the foundation of their life to come. On this particular afternoon, he suggested a walk despite the cold. They strolled through Russell Square, properly chaperoned by Grace trailing discreetly behind. The bare trees cast intricate shadows on the frozen ground, and their breath formed clouds in the frigid air. But wrapped in warm cloaks and with their hands clasped together, neither particularly noticed the temperature. "I have been thinking about our wedding," Sebastian said as they walked. "Where would you like to marry, Marianne?" Without hesitation, Marianne replied, "St. James' Church in Piccadilly." Sebastian stopped walking and turned to look at her in surprise. "The church where Thornton abandoned you?" "Yes," Marianne confirmed. "I want to reclaim that space, Sebastian. I want to transform it from a place of humiliation into a place of joy. I want to stand at that altar with you and replace the terrible memory with a beautiful one." "Are you certain?" Sebastian asked gently. "We can marry anywhere you wish. My family chapel at Lenox Hall, the fashionable church in Mayfair, anywhere at all." "I am certain," Marianne said firmly. "Hiding from that place would give it power over me. Returning to it as your bride takes that power back. I want to show everyone, including myself, that I survived and transformed that moment of devastation into something magnificent." Sebastian pulled her closer, mindless of propriety and watching eyes. "That altar represents your defiance, Marianne. We shall stand upon it together and declare your victory to the world. Very well, St. James' Church it shall be. We shall fill it with flowers and music and so much happiness that the stones themselves will forget any sadness they once witnessed." They were married on the 14th of February, 1815, exactly 1 year and 2 months after the day Miles Thornton had failed to appear. St. James Church was transformed into a bower of winter roses and evergreens, with candles blazing from every available surface, despite the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. The church was filled with guests representing both families and much of London society, all eager to witness this unlikely union between the reclusive Duke and the woman who had been left at the altar. But Marianne was aware only of Sebastian, standing tall and handsome at the altar in his formal attire, watching her approach with such open love that she felt tears threatening to spill. Her father walked her down the aisle with quiet dignity, and when he placed her hand in Sebastian's, he whispered, "Be happy, daughter. You deserve nothing less." The ceremony proceeded with solemn beauty. Marianne spoke her vows clearly and firmly, meaning every word with an intensity that surprised her. Sebastian's voice was equally steady, his eyes never leaving her face as he promised to love and cherish her for all their days. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Sebastian cupped Marianne's face in his hands exactly as he had that night in her drawing room and kissed her thoroughly, to the delighted cheers of the assembled guests. It was not precisely proper behavior for a formal church wedding, but neither of them cared in the slightest. As they processed back down the aisle together, Marianne caught sight of Lady Caroline and Lady Dorothea, both looking sour despite their polite smiles. She saw Lady Isabel sitting stiffly beside Captain Miles Thornton, who appeared distinctly uncomfortable. And she felt nothing but pity for all of them, trapped in their bitterness and judgment while she walked beside the man she loved toward a future bright with possibility. The wedding breakfast was held at Rothermere House, where Lady Vivian had outdone herself in creating a magnificent affair that spoke of generations of consequence. The Dowager Duchess pulled Marianne aside at one point, her sharp eyes suspiciously bright. "I was wrong about you," Lady Vivian admitted quietly. "I thought you might be using my son for social advancement, but I see now that you love him genuinely and have given him something I feared he would never find again. Thank you, Marianne. Thank you for bringing him back to life." "He did the same for me," Marianne replied honestly. "We saved each other, I think." "The best marriages often do," Lady Vivian said, with a knowing smile. That evening, Sebastian and Marianne departed London for their honeymoon at Lennox Hall in Northumberland. The journey took 3 days through increasingly wild and beautiful countryside, and with each mile traveled, Marianne felt herself shedding the weight of London's expectations and judgments. Lennox Hall was magnificent, a sprawling estate of golden stone set among rolling hills that stretched to distant mountains. In February, the landscape was stark and beautiful, with snow dusting the peaks and frost silvering the bare trees. It was remote and peaceful, exactly what both of them needed. Sebastian carried her over the threshold with ceremonial care, then set her down gently in the grand entrance hall. "Welcome home, Duchess," he said with a smile that made her heart race. "Home?" Marianne repeated wonderingly. "Yes, I believe it is." The weeks at Lennox Hall passed in a haze of happiness Marianne had never imagined possible. They spent long mornings in bed, talking and laughing and discovering each other with patient thoroughness. Afternoons were devoted to exploring the estate grounds, walking hand in hand through winter gardens and along frozen streams. Evenings found them curled together in the library, reading aloud to each other or simply existing in comfortable silence. Sebastian showed her the portrait gallery, where generations of Rothermeres stared down from gilded frames. He paused before a painting of a young woman with gentle eyes and soft features. "Anne," he said quietly, "my first Duchess." Marianne studied the portrait carefully. "She was lovely. You must have cared for her deeply." "I did," Sebastian confirmed. "But what I felt for Anne, while genuine, was different from what I feel for you, Marianne. Anne and I married young, brought together by family expectations and affection, but not truly knowing each other deeply. We might have grown into deeper love had we been given time. But you and I came together already wounded, already wise to life's cruelties. What we built was founded on honesty and understanding from the very beginning. I do not love you less because I loved Anne. I love you differently, more consciously, more deliberately. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Marianne assured him, threading her fingers through his. I do not need you to forget her, Sebastian. I only need you to have room in your heart for me as well. My heart has infinite room for you, Sebastian replied, pulling her close. You have become its center, Marianne, its reason for continuing to beat. On their final evening before returning to London, a heavy snowstorm descended upon Northumberland, blanketing the world in pristine white. Sebastian and Marianne stood at the library windows, watching the snowfall, wrapped together in a warm embrace. Are you ready to return to society? Sebastian asked quietly. To face all the obligations and expectations of being a duchess? As long as I face them with you, Marianne replied. Yes, I am ready, though I confess I shall miss this cocoon of privacy we have created here. We shall return often, Sebastian promised. Whenever London becomes too much, whenever we need refuge, Lennox Hall will be waiting. They returned to London in early March, taking up residence at Rothermere House while their own establishment was being prepared. The season would begin soon, and with it, Marianne's formal debut as the Duchess of Lennox. But she found herself facing the prospect with confidence rather than anxiety. She had Sebastian beside her, genuine love supporting her, and the knowledge that she had survived far worse than society's judgment. The years that followed brought abiding joy and deliberate contentment. Sebastian proved an attentive husband, never taking for granted the gift of second chances they had both been given. Marianne threw herself into her role as Duchess, using her position to support causes she believed in and creating a salon that welcomed intellectuals and artists alongside the traditional aristocracy. They had their first child, a son, 18 months after their wedding. They named him James Sebastian, and watching her husband cradle their infant son with such tender wonder made Marianne's heart overflow. Their daughter arrived 2 years later, and they named her Anne Cordelia, honoring both Sebastian's first Duchess and Marianne's own name. The gesture of naming their daughter after Anne was Sebastian's idea, a sign of complete healing and the integration of past and present. On Christmas Eve, 1818, 4 years after that fateful ball where their arrangement began, Sebastian and Marianne returned to Beaumont House for the annual Christmas celebration. They arrived with their 2 children and the evidence of Marianne's 3rd pregnancy just beginning to show beneath her elegant gown. The ballroom looked much as it had that night 4 years ago, all candlelight and evergreens and festive decoration. But everything else had changed. Marianne entered not as a humiliated spinster fleeing gossip, but as the respected Duchess of Lennox, secure in her position and her marriage. Lady Caroline Asherton approached with obsequious courtesy. Your Grace, how delightful to see you, and your children are absolutely lovely. Thank you, Lady Caroline, Marianne replied with genuine pleasantness. She had learned that holding grudges served no purpose. She could afford to be gracious now from her position of happiness and security. After the children were settled with nurses in a quiet room, Sebastian led Marianne onto the dance floor for the opening waltz. As they moved together through familiar patterns, Marianne found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. Do you ever regret it? She asked quietly. Our arrangement? The deception we began with? Never, Sebastian replied firmly. That arrangement was the gateway to the greatest happiness of my life. Yes, we began with strategy and pretense, but what we built from that foundation is real and true and more valuable than anything I could have imagined. I love you, Marianne said simply, more than I can properly express. And I love you, Sebastian replied. My second chance, my unexpected miracle, my Christmas gift that kept on giving. When the waltz concluded, Sebastian guided Marianne not back to the ballroom proper, but toward the conservatory where their story had truly begun. The space looked much the same, still filled with exotic plants and shadows, still a refuge from the glittering chaos beyond. They stood together where they had stood that night 4 years ago, when two wounded people had made an audacious agreement. "Do you remember?" Sebastian asked softly. "Every moment," Marianne confirmed. "You asked me to let you court me, to enter a temporary arrangement for mutual protection. You promised honesty and respect and no harm to either party." "I kept all those promises," Sebastian said, "but I broke one crucial rule." "Which rule was that?" "I fell completely, irreversibly, permanently in love with you," Sebastian replied. "That was never part of the original agreement." Marianne laughed, the sound echoing softly in the glass-enclosed space. "I broke that rule as well, most thoroughly and deliberately. I suppose we are both guilty of violating the terms we established." "Fortunately," Sebastian said, pulling her close, "the penalties for such violations include a lifetime of happiness and several beautiful children, and growing old together in contentment. I believe I can accept such punishment." "As can I," Marianne agreed, rising on her toes to kiss him. "As can I, my love," and with an affection that shall not waver. They remained in the conservatory for several more minutes, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the faint music from the ballroom and the soft rustle of exotic leaves around them. Through the glass ceiling, stars were visible in the cold December sky, brilliant and clear, promising another year of joy ahead. "Shall we return to the festivities?" Sebastian asked eventually. "I believe our children will be wondering where their parents have disappeared to." "In a moment," Marianne replied, not ready to release him quite yet. "Let me hold this perfect instant just a bit longer." And so they stood together as the Christmas celebration continued without them, two people who had found each other in the midst of grief and humiliation and transformed their strategic alliance into the truest love either had ever known. The fake courtship that was meant to protect them for a few weeks had become the real marriage that would sustain them for a lifetime. As they finally walked back toward the ballroom hand in hand, Marianne felt profound gratitude for the unexpected path her life had taken. Being left at the altar by Miles Thornton had seemed like the worst thing that could possibly happen. But it had been the necessary destruction that cleared space for something far better to grow. Sometimes the greatest gifts arrive veiled in tragedy. Sometimes devastation is merely preparation for transformation. And sometimes the man who offers you a fake courtship for Christmas becomes the real love you will treasure for all your days. Thank you so much for journeying with us through this tale of second chances and unexpected love. If this story of healing hearts and Christmas miracles touched you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of hope, resilience, and the transformative power of love.